Hello, I'm Esther Gidhui-Ewart. Welcome to Africa 54. Here's what's coming up. South Korea offers to increase development aid for Africa to $10 billion over the next 6 years. Hate and extremism is rising in the United States, with record numbers of white nationalists and anti-LGBTQ+ groups trying to undermine the country's inclusive democracy. And in our technology report, we'll hear from an expert on how artificial intelligence can be used in election management. All this and much more coming up on today's Africa 54. South Korea and African countries are vowing to expand their mutual cooperation in areas such as mining, energy, and manufacturing. The pledge was made at a business summit in Seoul on Wednesday. South Korean President Yoon Suk pledged Tuesday that his nation will increase development aid for Africa to $10 billion over the next 6 years and will offer $14 billion in export financing to promote trade and investment for South Korean companies in Africa.
The role of Africa has been gaining significant attention as the uncertainty in the global supply chain is increasing due to geopolitical risks. My hope is that the mutually beneficial resource cooperation will be expanded by establishing partnerships with key African countries for crucial minerals, and through the Mineral Security Partnership, which is the consultative group of value-sharing countries.
I'm confident that it's important to strengthen Korea's investment in Africa, build capacity, transfer technology, and ensure that Korean companies seize the opportunities they offer to African markets, especially in key sectors such as industrialization, agriculture, and the digital economy, and that we will achieve comprehensive and sustainable development.
South Korea's industry ministry said in a statement Wednesday that 47 agreements with 23 African countries were signed during the two-day summit as Asia's fourth largest economy seeks to tap into the minerals and vast export market in Africa. Top officials in South Africa's African National Congress have begun talks with representatives of 5 other parties on a coalition to form a government, but no decision has been made and the talks are at an early stage, according to the ANC. Wednesday, South Africa faces an election deadlock after the long-ruling ANC lost its 30-year majority in an election last week, but no party managed to overtake it. The ANC remains the biggest party. An ANC spokesperson says there have been exploratory talks with the main opposition Democratic Alliance Party, the far-left Economic Freedom Fighters, and 3 other smaller parties. But the new MK party of former President Jacob Zuma has not yet responded to an invitation for discussions. What will the new coalition government look like, and how will it affect the country's policies internally and globally? VOA's Nairobi Bureau Chief Maria Madialo has more.
South Africans say they are excited and eager to see what a coalition government is going to look like, days after elections show no party won an outright majority.
Oh, I'm excited because the ANC is finally going to be in a position where they have to reconsider how they've been approaching running the country and governing the country.
It's a very challenging for the ruling party. They have to think now which coalition they should do, because with DA it's something else. With EFF is something else. With the latest MK, it's also something else.
Depending on the coalitions, like if it is the DA and the ANC coalition together, the DA can actually get in and actually do some good where the ANC has failed.
The African National Congress secured 40% of the vote, followed by the Democratic Alliance with about 22%. A coalition between the two could reconcile the country, says Tendai Mbanje, election analyst.
The DA-ANC coalition promotes non-racialism. The DA-ANC coalition promotes unity in the country among 2 races. It could also strike balance between the competing differences in terms of addressing issues of poverty.
Other coalitions could be with the newly formed party led by former President Jacob Zuma, Umkhonto weSizwe or MK, which won about 15%, or the Economic Freedom Party, EFF, which won about 10% of the final vote tally. Edgar Githua is a professor at Strathmore University in Kenya. He spoke to us via Skype.
And unfortunately, Zuma has already pronounced himself on this and said he will only have a coalition with the ANC on condition that Cyril Ramaphosa is not going to be the president. It looks like ANC, EFF, and they need someone else. They need one of the other tiny ones to help them just pretty much get to the 51% to be able to form the government comfortably.
The ANC says its leader will not resign following election results, but is open to working with everyone to form a government that will serve South Africa's people.
At this stage in time, Cyril Ramaphosa is the best foot forward for the ANC, simply because of his reputation within and globally.
While internally, governance could improve with the coalition government, South Africa's positions on global issues such as the Russia-Ukraine and Israel-Hamas wars may come into question, both Mbanje and Githua say.
How they look at the Palestinian Hamas issue, those are some of the things that will now have to be renegotiated afresh within the coalition government, because all political parties have their manifestos, have how they want to project themselves.
South Africa has accused Israel of committing genocide in Gaza in a case they brought to the International Court of Justice. Israel argues that its ground offensive, which the Gaza Health Ministry says has killed about 36,000 Palestinians, is in response to Hamas militants' attack on Israel last year that killed 1,200 people, according to Israeli tallies. Mariama Diallo, VOA News.
The Sahel region is the new epicenter of global terrorism, prompting nations worldwide to intensify efforts to counter the violence through military training such as the Flintlock 2024 drills in Ghana and the Ivory Coast. Analysts, however, say that addressing economic deficiencies in the region is a more effective deterrent. Senanu Todd reports from Tamale, Ghana.
At the Tamale International Airport in Ghana, troops engage in a simulated gunfight. This drill is part of the US-Africa Security Partnership that aims to bolster efforts to combat terrorism in the region.
The most important objective for these exercises is to build partner capacity and capability. We focus on things like setting the theater, developing interoperability, and helping our partners to develop those capabilities that are necessary to achieve their security objectives in Africa.
Organized by the U.S. Department of Defense, Flintlock 2024 draws thousands of security stakeholders from Europe, Asia, and about 30 partner countries to Ghana and the Ivory Coast. For 2 weeks, they participate in combat simulations and share intelligence on countering terrorism. Sahel neighbors like Ghana, which has no record of terrorist activity, use these exercises to stay prepared.
We are observing that these terrorists and armed elements, their activities are progressing, and we need to find ways and means to match up.
Security analysts, however, argue that focusing on military responses to terrorism in the Sahel has failed. Despite the deployment of tens of thousands of military troops to the region, such as during France's Operation Barkhane and the United Nations MINUSMA and G5 Sahel Joint Force, terrorism has seen a significant rise. According to the Global Terrorism Index 2024, published by the Institute for Economics and Peace, Sub-Saharan Africa has become the new global epicenter of terrorism, accounting for over 50% of deaths from terrorism in 2023. Mutaru Mumunu Mukhtar, the executive director of the West Africa Center for Counter-Extremism, criticizes the militaristic approach.
It elicited a lot of, grievances within the local population. It ignored the realities of the vulnerabilities or the drivers of violent extremism, the issues of human security, the issues of job creation, addressing youth vulnerabilities, marginalization.
Mukhtar says without economic security, the youth become vulnerable and are easily radicalized by extremist groups.
The average young person believes that the IMF engagement with Africa or the local countries are built around conditionalities that prevents them from stimulating economic growth that can allow the state to recruit or create jobs for young people. And so they blame the West.
This sentiment is reflected by increasing calls for African nations to sever relationships with foreign partners. Strained relationships between the US and the nations of Niger and Chad are examples, with the US saying in April that it would withdraw its troops from both, potentially hampering counter-terrorism efforts in the Sahel. The US says it is committed to restoring its relationships based on shared values.
The United States is still discussing how security relations with Niger, for example, will be handled. And we all, and including Ghana and other ECOWAS countries, are concerned about democratic backsliding.
Experts say that if strained relationships and economic deficiencies in the Sahel region are not resolved, military-centric approaches to counter-terrorism are likely to continue. Sana Anutod, VOA News, Tamale, Ghana.
A report released Tuesday says hate and extremism in the United States rose in 2023 with record numbers of white nationalists and anti-LGBTQ+ groups trying to undermine the country's inclusive democracy. VOA's Veronica Balderas Iglesias has the details.
The LGBTQ+ community was one of the primary targets of hate and extremism in the U.S. in 2023, according to a report released Tuesday by the Southern Poverty Law Center. Researchers say hate-filled rhetoric and anti-government conspiracy theories also negatively affected immigrants, people of color, and minority faith communities.
Extremists, those who oppose inclusive democracy, spent the last year legitimizing insurrection, painting hate as virtuous, and transforming conspiracy theories into mainstream narratives. And they're all in preparation, I would say, towards one of the most significant elections in our history.
A total of 835 anti-government groups were active last year, up from 702 the previous year. The report found the number of active hate groups in the U.S. rose to 595 last year, up from 523 in the previous year. Craven says the groups are moving into the political realm with a specific goal.
To limit pluralism, it's to limit participation, it's to limit democracy itself.
U.S. President Joe Biden presents himself as the only viable option in the November presidential election to stop a rise in hate-filled rhetoric.
I'm not going to let Donald Trump turn America into a place that doesn't believe in honesty, decency, and treating people with respect. And I'll be damned if I'm going to let Donald Trump turn America into a place filled with anger and resentment and hate.
Donald Trump, the presumptive Republican nominee, sparked controversy when, as president, he blamed both sides for violent clashes at a 2017 white nationalist rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, that broke out between protesters and counter-protesters. During the demonstration, a white supremacist intentionally drove his car into a crowd of counter-protesters, killing one woman and injuring more than 30 people. Then President Trump addressed the violence, calling it an egregious display of hatred, bigotry, and violence on many sides. Trump has sided with groups at the forefront of book bans, such as Moms for Liberty, which the Southern Poverty Law Center listed again in 2023 as an anti-government extremist group opposed to inclusive education.
The radical left is even slandering Moms for Liberty as a so-called hate group. You're a hate group! Can you imagine? Moms for Liberty, hate group.
Moms for Liberty declined VOA's interview request. Experts say candidates must be careful about the rhetoric to quell any potential violence ahead of the November general election.
For Biden to continue to be present and speak about peace, but also the importance of voting generally. In terms of former President Trump, he's in a tricky spot because he certainly does garner more support when he uses some of this extremist language, but as a result, he's also marginalizing populations that might vote.
Rothschild also suggests voters watch out for conspiracy theories on mainstream and social media that may further fuel hate and extremism. Verónica Valderas Iglesias, VOA News, Washington.
Former U.S. President Donald Trump's felony conviction was a case where two federal agencies decided not to pursue: the U.S. Justice Department and the Federal Election Commission. Nonetheless, former President Trump was tried by New York's Manhattan District Attorney. Philip Alexiou talks with Cato Institute Senior Fellow Walter Olson to explain.
Well, part of the charges were simple and part of them get more complicated. And the simple part was that he was charged with falsifying business records, and a lot of the evidence was about that. Where it gets a little more complicated is New York was seeking to charge him under a more serious law with stiffer penalties and felony penalties for the type of business falsification that attempts to cover up the intent to commit a crime. Now, if they can prove that, which is what they set out to prove, as I say, the penalties are stiffer, but it opens up the question of what was that other crime. Now, that's where much of the confusion came in during the case, because there have been cited 3 or 4 different laws that Trump might have been trying to break by his falsification. And those appear in things like a memo from the prosecutor to the judge, but they were not necessarily explained clearly to the jury.
And so there's also a question of this affecting the election, but that would be under federal jurisdiction. And then you have the state trying to prosecute under the jurisdiction of the feds. So you understand where people might be a little confused about that.
It's not uncommon in prosecutions for both the federal government and the state government to have laws that they believe were broken and to independently prosecute. Now, the federal government looked at this series of transactions. They charged Trump's lawyer, but they didn't charge Trump. New York came in. Now, New York cannot prosecute under the federal laws, but New York has its own laws, in particular the business falsification one. They came in, and the fact that there are potential federal issues in the case doesn't mean that New York can't prosecute. They battled before the judge. Trump tried to get some of the charges thrown out on the grounds that it was too much like a federal issue, that the federal government's law preempted the state law, or that the New York law could apply only to New York campaigns, like for governor, and not to federal campaigns, like the one for president. The judge ruled against Trump on those motions, but of course he might come back on appeal and say the judge got it wrong.
Okay, so now the former president of the United States is convicted of a felony. What is his status right now as a citizen and as a voter? So could he go and vote, for example, in a primary election in New York or in Florida?
In Florida, where he would probably want to vote, the state's law is favorable to him, because although they will not let you vote if you are a convicted felon in Florida in many circumstances, if you were convicted in a different state, as here, and that state would let you vote currently, you can go ahead. So Florida will probably let him vote for now. That will change if he is incarcerated, but for now he could probably vote in Florida. And he is free to move around and do most things that he could do before the conviction until sentencing comes in July. And it's at that point that we learn to what extent he will be able to go out on the campaign trail, because that will depend on how Judge Merchant rules in his July sentencing.
Walter Olson is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute's Robert A. Levy Center for Constitutional Studies. We'd like to hear what you think about Africa 54 and all our VOA Africa programs on our website at voaafrica.com. Still to come, the challenges and issues of integrating artificial intelligence into election management. We'll be right back.
This week on Straight Talk Africa, South Africa's ruling African National Congress Party lost its majority in last week's elections for the first time in 30 years Now it has to form a coalition government with another party in order to govern. What does this mean for the future of the country and its people? Join me, Vincent Makori, for an in-depth discussion on what's next for South Africa.
You're watching VOA's Red Carpet. My name is Jackson Vunganyi. Thank you so much for joining us each week right here on Red Carpet. We bring you the latest in
In other news, nearly 2 million people are displaced in Burkina Faso by growing violence between Islamic extremists and security forces. About 60% of the displaced are children, and many are traumatized by their experiences. But mental health services in the West African country are limited, and children are often overlooked for treatment. Somaliland's first girls basketball team is determined to put Somaliland on the map by playing in international competitions, but there is a catch. Somaliland is not a country. The breakaway territory is struggling to gain international recognition from any foreign government, despite governing itself and enjoying comparative peace and stability since declaring independence in 1991. And the United Nations is reporting that global public debt rose to a record $97 trillion last year, with developing countries owing roughly 1/3 of that, hampering their ability to pay for basic government services like healthcare, education, and climate action. UN Trade and Development says the value of money owed by governments rose by $5.6 trillion from 2022. Integrating artificial intelligence into election management can enhance accuracy and fairness, prevent fraud, and automate voter registration using biometric data. However, implementing AI in elections also presents challenges and issues. Dr. Momar Dieng, a Harvard University professor and Dean of Business at the African Leadership University in Kigali, Rwanda, discussed these issues with VOA's Paul Ndiho.
The emergence of these AI tools is really going to revolutionize how politics is done, not just in Africa, all over the world. We already see signs of it. When you look at most political systems, is that a lot of times political parties only give attention to voters during campaigns and around election times. And that's one of the things that AI can really help with. You've seen already chatbots, that are being used by African parties in certain countries to be able to ask questions in real time, get sentiment from voters, ask them specific questions about issues that they are concerned with. And that used to take a lot of resources, a lot of human presence on the ground, boots on the ground to be able to do, which means a lot of money. Now, political parties will be able to do that in a very cheap way. Technology is going to change that game and really allow small movements to be able to have a much larger reach immediately and have contact with voters that is increasingly going to feel very real, even though it's powered by AI.
Let's stay on the issue of regulation. How important is regulation when it comes to regulating this new technology?
It should be regulated in the same way that drugs and food are regulated, right? You wouldn't imagine an environment where your country would just let any drugs come in without really ensuring that they actually perform according to the claims of the makers and that they don't cause more harm than good. So it's going to be a similar situation where we cannot we cannot prevent the use of these tools, but we'll have to make sure that our governments and our regulators are equipped to be able to rein them in and put some boundaries when it comes to the use of personal information, when it comes to slandering, for instance, and spreading false information on individuals. These are some of the issues that we will have to contend with very soon, and it's going to be important for our governments and our policymakers to really start thinking very early on how they may be able to, fine-tune the tools that they have at their disposal, so that it doesn't end up being about, for instance, shutting down the internet, as is the case sometimes when we have elections on the continent, or, having some of these blunt force methods. That's not going to work anymore. It's not going to be about censorship. It's going to be about finding much more fine-grained ways to punish those who misuse them.
How about for those people who say that maybe slow down on regulation, let these technologies develop, and then once they are developed and they're in use, then people can regulate them? What do you say to them?
We cannot afford that. We live on a continent which, for better or worse, is very diverse, and in certain areas, the spread of misinformation can quickly spiral into ethnic conflict, into all types of conflict, right? I don't need to name examples or name countries. I think that you know very well what I'm alluding to. So these are very specific situations where we cannot afford to run the natural experiment and then come back later. We've seen what that has led to in West Africa, even in the Central Africa region, with civil wars and genocides and other situations like that, that all started from being able to use even tools that were not, as advanced, just radio. And so imagine now the impact that having the ability to make make up completely false information that looks so realistic that you can put your finger on it, you can see a video, you can hear a person say something that they've never said or do something they've never done, right? That is now possible, and we really need to be very careful, particularly in the context of the fragile situations that we have on our continent in terms of making sure that this is not used to spread conflict and be able to degenerate into armed conflict or other situations.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Paul. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Dr. Momar Dieng is a Harvard University professor and Dean of the School of Business at the African Leadership University in Kigali, Rwanda. And that does it for us today. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com. From all of us here in Washington, thanks for watching.